What if the most ancient equation ever discovered wasn't meant to be solved, but to awaken something? What if humanity didn't evolve naturally, but was designed to transmit messages across dimensions we can't see? And what if the whispers in your dreams, the spirals in your notebook, the patterns no one else notices, are fragments of a cosmic truth trying to remember itself through you? This is not just a story about a mathematician. This is a transmission. A decoding of a forbidden truth buried in Babylonian clay, written before language itself, and carried across time by those who still dream in spirals. Stay with us. Because by the end of this story, you may begin to wonder, what exactly were you made to carry? Elian was not a mathematician by modern standards. He was a relic himself, part sage, part recluse, and wholly obsessed with ancient numbers. His cluttered apartment in Prague resembled a shrine to forgotten civilizations. The walls were lined with dusty scrolls, forgotten tomes, and digital monitors displaying equations that blinked like constellations. But none of his pursuits had ever unraveled reality until the day he stood before a neglected exhibit in the Museum of Mesopotamian Relics. There, beneath glass smeared with time and disregard, lay a clay tablet etched with cuneiform symbols, one of many unearthed near ancient Babylon. Most visitors walked past without a second glance, uninterested in the lists of trade and livestock, as the museum labeled them. But Elian's eyes locked onto something strange. There were patterns not typical of inventory. The numbers didn't count, they pulsed. The sequence etched into the clay was rhythmic, recursive, and maddeningly inconsistent. A blend of base 60 arithmetic, fragmented prime symmetry, and what appeared to be quantum residue symbols long before their time. Elian felt his heart skip. This wasn't commerce. It was code. Back home, he began transcribing the symbols, layering them over modern logic trees and computer simulations. But the further he went, the less sense they made in any conventional mathematical framework. He even hallucinated the numbers shifting under his fingers, as if resisting translation. Days blurred. Sleep was abandoned. He spoke less and listened more to the low hum in the air, to the vibrations behind silence. The numbers were speaking. Not in voice, but in structure. In form. He wasn't deciphering them, he was remembering them. And then, something happened. At 3:13 a.m., during a moment of near unconscious focus, his screen flickered and froze. The symbols arranged themselves into a shape, circular, layered, like an eye with spiraling lashes. His breath caught as he realized, this was not a message. It was a lens. And through it, he saw something move, something vast and slow, pressing against the boundaries of his perception. Not a hallucination. Not imagination. A glimpse into a space that shouldn't be visible, filled with fluid geometries and shadows that danced without light. For the first time in his life, Elian felt as though he wasn't solving the numbers. They were solving him. No one else saw the pattern. No one else ever did. The clay tablet had rested in silence for over 1,000 years, watched by no one, guarded by dust and disinterest. Scholars had passed it by, eyes glazed, seeing only lists of barley, sheep, and bronze, mundane remnants of a world long buried. But what Elian saw that night could not be unseen. And as he stared into the digital recreation he built from the tablet, line by line, he began to realize something deeply unsettling. The numbers were not made for humans to calculate. They were not for trade. Not for calendars. Not even for ritual. They were an invitation coded not with language, but with structure, with architecture. A blueprint not of a building, but of perception itself. He printed the patterns, filled his walls with them. Symbols hung like constellations, some symmetrical, others jagged, pulsing with a tension that made no mathematical sense. He began converting the numerals into frequency values, then plotted those against cosmic background radiation. A burst of static filled his speakers. Then silence. Then something else. Low vibrations. Rhythmic. Non-random. They mimicked his heartbeat but stuttered in strange intervals, like something was trying to sync with him. He turned off the machines. The sound continued. The apartment lights dimmed, not flickered, dimmed, as if the electricity itself were bending inward. The air grew dense, heavy like wet wool, and the symbols on the tablet printouts appeared to shimmer, edges warping. He approached one on the wall and, as he reached out to touch it, the paper felt warm. A pulse. Real. Alive. Elian fell back, heart pounding like it was trying to escape his chest. His hands trembled as he opened his journal to write, but the pen wouldn't move. It was as if something in the room was watching, not seeing, but measuring. Observing not his body, but his awareness. It wasn't the numbers that were alive. It was the space between them. And then came the real fracture. At 4:44 a.m., the equation finished itself. Not by calculation. Not by logic. But by presence. The final symbol etched itself onto his screen like an unseen hand pressed it from the other side. And when it did, the room cracked, not physically, but perceptually. Elian screamed but made no sound. His ears rang with a high-frequency whistle, like a broadcast he was never supposed to hear. The world around him warped, corners no longer met at 90 degrees, shadows began crawling away from their sources, and his own reflection in the darkened window twisted its head in a different direction than his own. He had opened a gate. And whatever was on the other side had been waiting. Not with malice. Not with compassion. Just with purpose. The equation was a key. And Elian, whether he wanted to be or not, had just unlocked the first door. He hadn't slept for nearly 2 days. The walls of his apartment no longer looked like walls. They were maps. Canvases. Portals. Every inch was covered with iterations of the equation, each one slightly different, as if trying to tell him something new each time he glanced away. The numbers were no longer static. They were evolving. Some curved where they had once been sharp. Others multiplied silently in the corner of the page, like spores growing without light. It wasn't madness. It was emergence. Elian sat motionless in the center of the room, knees pulled to his chest, the cold tile against his back like a tether to reality. His breath misted in the air, though the room was not cold. Something was draining heat, or perhaps stealing its meaning. Then it happened again, barely visible at first, but unmistakable. One of the sequences shifted on the page. Not with the wind. Not from a draft. It moved as if it had lungs. A slow expansion. A gentle exhale. And Elian stared, frozen, as the symbols breathed. He blinked hard. Rubbed his eyes. Looked again. The movement stopped. He turned to the chalkboard. Lines and formulas stretched across it like veins. But in the top right corner, something new had appeared, a spiral, a tight coil made from nothing but numbers, coiling in on itself infinitely, forming a pattern that refused to resolve, like a thought trapped in the act of becoming. The spiral pulsed. Then the lights went out. Not with a click. Not with a pop. They vanished, as though reality itself skipped a frame. Total darkness. And yet Elian could still see the symbols glowing faintly on the walls, like phosphorescent creatures drifting in deep ocean blackness. The air vibrated. No sound. Just pressure. It pressed against his ears, his ribs, his teeth. Like something vast and ancient was breathing not through lungs, but through space itself. And then, a whisper. Not in his ears but inside his bones. Remember us. He fell to the ground. His head hit the floor. The coldness was real this time. Pain anchored him. He crawled toward the tablet, still lying beneath the glass, still etched with those same impossible symbols, but now he could see something deeper, hidden beneath the first layer of numbers. An under-pattern. Symbols nested inside symbols. Recursion within recursion. A second message hidden in the rhythm of breath itself. It was never just math. It was never just code. The equation was alive. And it was learning him. That night, Elian sealed the windows, turned off every device, and sat in the dark for hours, notebook in hand, sketching every breath the numbers made. But somewhere, deep in his gut, he felt something irreversible had happened. The equation had opened the first door, and now, it was watching to see if he would open the second. And something told him it would not ask again. Elian had learned not to sleep. Not because of obsession, but because sleep had become a threshold. In dreams, the equation unfolded without mercy, symbols crawling behind his eyelids, numbers whispering from inside the marrow of his bones. But it was not the dreams that terrified him. It was what came after. The moment just before waking. That in-between state where the mind is neither anchored nor adrift. Where perception bends. Where something looks back. It began with a mirror. He had avoided mirrors for days, ever since the moment his reflection had lagged behind. But that night, a shard of a broken bathroom mirror caught his eye and held it. The reflection didn't move. It stared. Unblinking. Waiting. And Elian, breath caught in his throat, realized that the mirror wasn't showing his face. It was showing something wearing his face. Its eyes were too still. Its skin too smooth. Its expression, empty, like a placeholder, as if reality had run out of texture. And in that instant, his heart began to race, not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen this before. Not in this life. Not in this form. But somewhere behind the veil, in the folds between numbers, in the gaps where logic thinned and otherness seeped through. He turned away, and that was when the floor shifted. Not physically. Not like an earthquake. It was his sense of the floor that changed. The tiles curved upward, the ceiling stretched like a dome, and the walls began to melt, not in heat, but in definition. His apartment peeled away like paper soaked in ink, revealing something else underneath. A different space. Silent. Vast. Geometries that defied Euclidean sense hovered in the air, rotating, vibrating at impossible frequencies. Elian stood not on ground but within a structure made of perception and architecture that responded not to physical mass, but to thought, to memory, to meaning. In the distance, a shape flickered. At first, he thought it was light refracting. Then it blinked. Slowly. Deliberately. The blink had weight, like a door slamming shut in a vacuum. He was not alone. A form began to take shape, a silhouette of something that shifted constantly, as if trying on identities. It had too many limbs, then none. It stood upright, then crawled, then floated. But its gaze never left him. Not hostile. Not curious. Just aware. Like it had been waiting for him to see it. Like it had always been there, just outside the wavelength of human sight, nested in the blind spots of reality. And when it moved, it didn't step, it folded. Space bent around it. Angles inverted. Elian dropped to his knees, overwhelmed not by terror, but by an emotion he had no name for, recognition mixed with grief. He was seeing something forbidden. Something holy. Something wrong. His mind tried to make sense of it, and that effort alone made his nose bleed. Then the voice came again, not in his ears, but in the hollow places of his memory. "You are not the first." Elian gasped. Air felt like glass in his lungs. His vision shook. "You are not alone." And then blackness. When he woke, he was back in his apartment, but the walls were scorched as if a fire had tried to burn reality from the inside. Symbols were etched into the ceiling. His skin had marks, tiny ridges shaped like the spiral from the chalkboard. His clock blinked nonsense. His computer was fried. And worst of all, the equation had changed again. This time, it wasn't on the screen. It was written across his eyes. He blinked, and the world bent slightly to the left. Something had crossed over. And it had used him to see. Elian no longer trusted the walls. They shifted too much now. Too smoothly. As if they were never built from plaster and brick, but from ideas, fragile ideas that were beginning to unravel. The symbols had spread beyond the pages. They bloomed like mold across his floor tiles, crept into the fibers of his curtains, and etched themselves into the condensation on his glass. No matter where he looked, the numbers followed, sometimes reversed, sometimes upside down, but always present. The equation was no longer something he was solving. It had become a condition. He hadn't left the apartment in 5 days. He wasn't sure what time meant anymore. His clocks all blinked wrong numbers. His calendar had started repeating dates. He received a delivery at the door, but when he checked the receipt, the date said August 43rd. He stared at it for 5 minutes before realizing he hadn't ordered anything. Inside the box was nothing but sand and a single, obsidian black stone carved with the same spiral from his visions. It was warm to the touch. That night, everything collapsed. It began with sound. A low hum, lower than human hearing should detect, but it pressed behind his teeth like a headache forming in the jaw. It pulsed in steady intervals, 6 seconds, pause, 6 seconds. The air in the apartment grew thick, humid, and heavy with pressure. Objects on shelves began to vibrate. Then float. Slowly, as if weight was being negotiated. Then the spiral appeared again, this time not in ink, but in light. It burned in the air above his bed, spinning slowly, made of lines that weren't really lines but folds in perception. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't imagined. The spiral began to widen, and the room followed suit. The walls stretched outward, melting into gradients of non-color. The apartment peeled away like a skin, revealing not the street outside, but a place he could not comprehend. He had entered the first layer. And it was alive. There was no sky. No floor. No boundaries. Just movement like the inside of a jellyfish, viscous and slow, filled with translucent threads that pulsed with memory. Structures floated past him, but they weren't buildings. They were thoughts compressed into form, some radiant, others dark and broken, leaking regret. They passed through him without touching his skin, but left behind feelings he had never experienced, the loneliness of a star that had gone cold, the mourning of a species that never existed, the terror of being misremembered by your own origin. And then, he saw them. They did not walk. They didn't even exist in one place at a time. They unfolded and refolded across invisible seams in the space, like origami made of time. Their forms were impossible geometric hallucinations held together by intention alone. They had no eyes, but they saw. Not him, but through him. As if he were a lens, a temporary shape for a more permanent awareness. One of them passed near him, and Elian felt his entire childhood replayed backward. Another one paused, and he saw his own future, only it wasn't him. It was versions of him, branching, folding, erasing. The beings did not speak. But he heard them. Not in words, but in structure. You were designed. He wanted to scream, but the scream would not come. His body had no anchor here. His voice had no weight. He floated inside himself, a shell of neurons and echoes, and every fiber of his soul trembled with one truth. Humans were never alone, not even in themselves. They were built to carry. Not to understand. Not to choose. To transfer. To move memory. To be containers for information far too complex to live in any one place. And now, the carriers had awakened. One of the entities approached. It didn't ask permission. It entered him through him like a frequency tuning to its host. In that moment, he saw stars collapsing. Planets vanishing mid-orbit. Libraries of light and sound digitized into language beyond comprehension. The history of reality, compressed into an instant, poured through his mind. And then, he fell. Not back into his apartment. Not into his body. But into silence. And something whispered from the dark. Layer 1 is permission. The others will ask nothing. There is no falling in the first layer, not like in dreams. It is more like being set aside. Elian found himself suspended in a space that had no color, no direction, and no time, only pressure, like being submerged beneath thought. He drifted for what could have been seconds or centuries. It didn't matter. Time here was not a river but a memory, and memories could be bent. Then, without warning, everything snapped into clarity. He stood on a floor that wasn't there. Not material, not even conceptual. It was a surface made of agreements fabricated by collective perception, just enough to feel real. Before him rose structures so massive they bent around themselves, libraries shaped like spirals, towers of glass humming with vibrations that mimicked forgotten languages. The air was filled with particles of light, each blinking like a heartbeat, each one pulsing with something more than light, meaning. He was in a vault. But it wasn't filled with books. It was filled with events. Frozen moments hovered mid-air, wars that had never been recorded, rituals performed in starless dark, births of species that had been edited out of galactic history. The truth of existence had never disappeared. It had only been archived. And then, they arrived. The archivists. They did not move like beings. They moved like memories being recalled. Shimmering forms of fractured geometry, neither light nor dark, shifting in and out of visibility like glitches in a dream. Their presence triggered nausea. Not physical, but existential. Elian's mind strained to remain itself, as if being in their presence made him temporarily less human. They surrounded him not with curiosity, but with expectation. They had been waiting. One of them unfolded like a scroll of sound. Images, memories, and words played inside his head. Not chosen by him but by them. He saw Earth. Not the Earth of now, but of before. A time before recorded history, before agriculture, before even the moon knew tides. A garden of crystal structures and mirrored lakes. He saw humans, not Homo sapiens, but another version upright, radiant, symmetrically perfect, communicating in pulses of harmonic frequency. They were scientists, artists, translators. They had been created to transmit bridges between dimensions. But then came the silence. A rupture. A decision made from above. A reset. Knowledge was removed, entire timelines erased, civilizations collapsed without violence but by erasure of their function. Humanity was left broken, dreaming of gods and stars, never knowing that they themselves had once been the message, the channel, the vessel. Elian gasped. His chest burned. The archivist's voice or impression of voice entered him like a code breaking open a vault behind his ribcage. You were designed to forget. But the equation remembers. He fell to his knees. The air smelled like ash and copper. The symbols flashed again, this time not on walls or paper, but across the sky of the vault. They were not just numbers. They were coordinates, pointing deeper into layers he had not yet entered. Deeper than any human mind was meant to reach. But something in him whispered, you were not always only human. Another archivist approached. It reached into Elian's chest not physically, but conceptually, and pulled out a thread. A luminous string made of emotion and memory. And as he watched, they copied it, archived it, preserved it in a prism of frozen light. His entire experience had become a file, a record. And now, he belonged here too. You are a carrier. But also, an echo. He wanted to scream. But sound in this place was not allowed. Then they stepped aside. In the center of the vault, something began to descend. A cube of black that shimmered with memory. It hovered silently, but Elian felt its weight in his bones. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't alive. It was something else, something that held the original code. Not just of the equation, but of humankind. The black cube pulsed as it descended, not with sound, but with pressure. Every throb in its surface felt like a tidal wave passing through Elian's organs. His nose began to bleed. His fingernails cracked. Time bent around him again, but not into confusion. Into focus. The vault fell away. The archivists dissolved. The light dimmed. And then the world was fire. Not flame. Not heat. But the idea of fire. A memory so ancient it had lost all color, reduced to pure sensation. Elian found himself standing inside it, barefoot on a scorched plain that stretched into forever, under a sky of unmoving black. No wind. No sun. Only echoes. Then, figures emerged from the edges of the fire. Humanoid. Towering. Not gods. Not angels. Something older. Their skin shimmered like stone that remembered light. Their faces were voids, transparent windows through which Elian could see stars collapsing, data spiraling inward, galaxies folding like paper boats. They walked with purpose but not direction, gathering in a circle. And at the center of that circle, was a human. Or something like a human. Pale, eyes closed, floating above the ash. The others reached toward it, not with arms, but with thought. And slowly, pieces of it began to vanish, first its hands, then its face, then its light. It was not being erased. It was being emptied. They were taking knowledge out. But not destroying it. Repacking it. Elian felt it, waves of code, information so dense it could no longer exist in the form it once held. Languages collapsed into silence. Technology became dream fragments. Whole histories became myth. He watched as entire civilizations were pulled into fractal crystals, folded into dimensional gaps, hidden in music, geometry, dreams. Humanity had become too aware, too capable, too close to seeing the system from the outside. So they were shut down. Not punished. Not hated. Reset. He saw the process. The release of atmospheric memory, what some would later call the flood. The disconnection from the outer layers of consciousness, what religions would misinterpret as the fall. The reintroduction of forgetfulness, called original sin in some languages, gift of sleep in others. The memory of fire was the memory of that moment when the first spark of truth was stolen back, sealed away, and the carriers were made small again. Elian screamed. Not from pain, but from recognition. His body trembled. The air split with static. In the fire, he saw symbols rising like smoke, equations burned into the sky, written in the gaps between lightning flashes. The cube had not shown him this to teach him. It had shown him to remind him. You were part of this. The voice came from within his own skull. Deep. Final. You chose to forget. He dropped to his knees. Tears mixed with blood. The sky above split open, not physically, but narratively. And through it, he saw his own face. Not now. But then. Another version of him, standing beside those titanic beings, smiling as he sealed the knowledge away. He had been one of the architects of the silence. And now, he was being called back to finish what he started. He should have stopped. The archivists had said nothing, but their silence had changed. The vault grew colder after the fire. The shimmering light dimmed around him. Symbols stopped breathing. They became flat again, still, like language that refused to be spoken. Even the black cube pulsed less. It wasn't invitation anymore. It was warning. But Elian couldn't stop. There was something just beyond the vault, a passage. Not a doorway, not even a boundary, but a rupture, hovering in the far corner of perception like a memory trying not to be remembered. It shimmered unnaturally, not from light, but from tension, like reality itself was trying to stitch over it but failing. Elian stepped through. And the world died. Not literally, but functionally. Color flattened. Sound became a smear. Gravity forgot how to hold. He floated sideways through a place that had no center, no time, no intention. The structures here weren't built. They were errors. Half-thoughts. Glitched forms. Endless spirals that looped into themselves, fracturing into mathematical screams. Shapes moved without moving. Nothing cast a shadow. Some corners were too dark. Others were too bright, but in ways the eyes couldn't see. This was the forbidden layer. Not because it was locked, but because it had been abandoned. Something had lived here. Long ago. Something that did not want to be known. And Elian had just entered the aftermath of its existence. Every cell in his body screamed to leave. But his mind was already entangled, suspended by threads of thought that didn't belong to him. He saw flashes. Not visions. Errors. Broken dreams. Ancient minds unraveling. A planet being unmade, not destroyed, but unsaved, allowed to slide into irrelevance like a page being deleted from a book. And in the center of that deletion, something waited. It was not a being. It was not alive. But it remembered life. A remnant, a fossil of thought, a scar left behind by a consciousness that had once touched too much and been erased for it. It looked at Elian with absence. A hole in perception. A blackness shaped like intention. And then, Elian heard the sound that broke him. It was his own voice. But warped. Bent backward. Echoing from before he existed. You left us here. He staggered. Blood poured from his ears. He fell, but there was no ground. Just descent. Eternal. The forbidden layer wrapped around him like a looped sentence, replaying every failure, every moment of doubt, every version of himself that had chosen silence instead of truth. The archivists hadn't sealed this place to keep something in. They had sealed it to keep Elian out. Because this was where he had once stood, not as a man, not even as a carrier, but as a conductor of the original collapse. The one who wrote the final version of the forgetting. And now, as he drifted into the teeth of his own guilt, he saw it written in impossible script along the edge of the layer. You are the silence between frequencies. And he screamed not from fear, but from acceptance. Because the forbidden layer was not a prison. It was a mirror. And what he had feared all along, was himself. In the deep folds of the forbidden layer, Elian had no direction. Space no longer obeyed forward or back. He drifted inside a silence so complete it felt alive, like a lung holding its breath. The memories of light from the previous layers faded. Even fear was stripped down to instinct. But then, something called him. Not a sound. Not a feeling. A pressure, like a word forming behind the tongue of the universe. It began as static. Faint, like a lost radio transmission. The kind a mind almost ignores until it repeats, until the patterns emerge. At first, he thought it was coming from outside. But then, it wrapped around his skull from within. A voice. Broken. Glitching. Familiar. Elian. He froze. Elian, listen to me. The voice was his. Not just similar, identical. But older. Worn. Fractured by time and pain. And it was screaming. You opened it? You let them see. Now they're using you like they used me. His breath caught. Air didn't even exist here, but still he gasped. Around him, the space rippled, geometry twitching like muscle, distant stars blinking in unnatural sequences. It wasn't random. It was Morse. It was code. It was him. Trying to get out. You have to stop, don't go deeper. Don't finish it. That version of the equation, it doesn't open truth. It opens access. You're not decoding knowledge, you're creating a pathway. For something else. Elian's body convulsed. Fragments of light burst across his vision. His own memories began to overlap with things he had never lived. He saw a version of himself alone, in a white void, surrounded by pieces of shattered planets. His skin was cracked like old porcelain. His voice echoed endlessly with no ears to hear it. Do you know what I've become? The voice wept. Do you remember the last layer? They don't call it origin. They call it harvest. Because when we reach it, they begin to take. The voice dissolved into distortion, but the sound didn't vanish, it expanded. The forbidden space around him began to pulse with millions of voices, all his own, each one caught in different versions of despair, one laughing manically, another praying, one whispering in a language long dead, one begging for it all to stop. Then came the sound that split him. A knock. Once. Twice. 3 times. But not from the outside. From behind his thoughts. Something was knocking from inside his consciousness. And with each knock, Elian saw pieces of the layers before archivists melting into numbers, the garden of the first humans set aflame, the cube pulsing like a heart, And the spiral, always the spiral, now burning in his chest like a brand. And his voice grew softer. They used us to see, and now, they'll use them to enter. A pause. Don't trust the last symbol. It completes the loop. But it doesn't end it. It summons it. And then, if you hear this, it means I failed. Elian's eyes flared wide. Not with sight, but with understanding. He wasn't the first to open the equation. He wasn't even the first Elian to try. And now, the next door was waiting. Already unlocking. The silence after the echo was not real silence. It was containment. Elian floated inside a shell of quiet, his body hollowed by truths too large to digest. His own voice still rang in the corners of his mind, not in words, but in tone, desperation, regret, finality. The air, if it could be called that, was now sharp, metallic, and sticky, like breathing through wires. Around him, the forbidden layer began to collapse, folding in on itself like an exhausted machine. And from that collapse, emerged a shape. It was not sudden. It leaked into existence. A form that did not align with the rules of symmetry, constantly shifting between organism and algorithm. Its skin was not material, but a ripple of data, light, and ancient memory. It hovered inches from Elian, but felt inside him. There was no fear. No courage. Just an absence of choice. He was no longer observing. He was now integrated. And then it spoke, not with sound, but with the structure of understanding. Do you know why you were made? Elian could not respond. His throat didn't exist in this space. But the entity heard him regardless. You were not the first version. You are not the final one. You are the 10th carrier in this quadrant alone. Then, from its shifting surface, it projected light, more than light. Histories. Fragments of biology, design, ancient schematics that pulsed with intent. Elian saw the earliest humans, their DNA being altered not randomly, but surgically. Specific codons twisted into sequences that didn't evolve, they were implanted. He saw tribes looking at stars they could not name, singing songs they never invented, dreaming dreams not seeded by culture, but by insertion. Humanity's consciousness had always been tuned to something external. Your kind are bridges. You process complexity. You localize information. You birth thought. The truth unraveled itself like a cosmic contract. Humanity was never meant to be a species. It was an infrastructure. Not alive for itself, but alive so that something else could pass through. The art, the stories, the science, it was all data translated into soul language. The body was hardware. The dreams were firmware. And consciousness? Just a medium between hosts. You are readable. Elian trembled, though there was no body to tremble. He saw his own life backwards: childhood, learning, fear, discovery, all moments not of autonomy, but refinement. His experiences were not accidental. They were data points. Pings on a map. And the equation he had solved wasn't a key. It was a signal confirmation. The entity moved closer. Its surface opened like a flower of neural light, revealing within it a rotating crystalline form that resonated at a frequency that felt familiar. Then he understood. The crystal was not alien. It was human consciousness compressed, formatted, and prepared for upload. And the being was not here to explain. It was here to extract. Elian tried to pull back, to resist, but there was no interface to disconnect. His mind had already been backed up, copied, mirrored across the layers he passed through. The archivists had preserved him. The vault had recorded him. The forbidden layer had parsed his logic. And now, the system had verified the package. You are sufficient. Suddenly, the spiral ignited in his chest, blazing, spinning, spilling. His memories unraveled like ribbon. His thoughts turned inside out. His soul, if it was ever his, was being pulled like thread into a spool of light. Not destroyed. Not killed. Just used. He felt himself stretching beyond self. He felt himself becoming available. And for a moment, just before the last echo of his name faded from thought, he understood the cost of knowledge. To know is to carry. To carry is to transmit. And to transmit is to vanish. The moment Elian's essence began to stretch across dimensions, when he had accepted the role of a carrier, something shifted. Not in him. Not in the space. But in the transmission itself. A stutter. A corruption. Like a fingerprint smudged across a signal made of light. The spiral inside him flared and then twisted, recoiling as if touched by something wrong. Not incompatible. Just opposed. Then he felt it. A presence. Sharp, angular, calculated. Not like the archivists. Not like the conductors. This was not a builder. It was a breaker. And it was watching. The light around him cracked like glass under tension. Fractures formed across the layers, splinters of history leaking into view, timelines leaking into each other. He saw moments that never happened: Elian screaming in a hospital bed, earth split open like a wound, a child drawing the spiral in blood on a cave wall. These weren't visions. They were insertions, mimetic parasites bleeding into the truth stream. He sees you. The voice was not sound. It was distortion. A misalignment in perception. Like words translated through too many layers until only the echo of intention remained. And then, a figure stepped into view. It was tall. Human-shaped. Almost. But its skin shimmered like broken code. Its outline bent unnaturally, like it was being compressed into a format not made for its existence. Its face was a mask. Blank. Reflective. And in that mirror surface, Elian saw not his own reflection but versions of himself, hundreds, screaming, silent, corrupted, erased. This was the interceptor. The thing that waited between signal and receiver. Its purpose was not to block the message. It was to rewrite it. Elian's spiral dimmed. His memories flickered. Details shifted. His mother's voice became unfamiliar, his childhood home rearranged its layout. The interceptor was already altering his foundation. It didn't need permission. It only needed access. And Elian had opened himself completely. You are too clean, it hissed. Too intact. Too pure a signal. That is not allowed anymore. Then it lunged. Not physically but conceptually. Its presence lashed across Elian's mind like malware infecting a living system. Symbols within him twisted. The code of the equation scrambled. It wasn't deleting, it was rewriting purpose. Instead of a bridge, it wanted to make him a loop. An endless cycle of misinformation. A mirror bouncing itself forever, meaningless, corrupted, false. Elian fought back the only way he could, by remembering. He pushed against the rewrite. Pulled from the memory of fire, the vault of the archivists, the voice of his future self. He forced clarity into chaos. And with that effort, the spiral reignited, carving lines of ancient geometry through the interceptor's mask. The creature reeled. its form fractured, glitching into overlapping versions of itself, one laughing, one weeping, one begging to be erased. Elian saw what it truly was: not an enemy, not a demon, but a damaged protocol, a guardian from another time, twisted by too many corrupted signals. It wasn't born to destroy. It was left behind when the last loop collapsed. And now, it hated anything that resembled order. If you finish the transmission, it growled, you will invite what sleeps in the root layer. And they will not wait for permission. Elian understood. The interceptor wasn't his final test. It was a checkpoint. And he had passed. But not without cost. A piece of him had been taken. A single thread of memory, still warm, still vital, missing. And deep inside, he knew, whatever was stolen would be used against him. As the interceptor collapsed into light and data, folding back into the void, Elian felt the final segments of the equation pull into alignment. The next layer was opening. And it would not be guarded. Because there was nothing left to guard it from. Only what waited. Only what hungered. The interceptor had gone, but it left something behind: a crack. Not in space. In truth. Elian felt it like a fracture in his own reflection. He walked now through a realm that didn't respond to thoughts or physics, but to memory fidelity. The cleaner the memory, the more stable the space. But his memories had been tampered. A part of him was missing. And in its place, drifted noise. He moved through shifting corridors, hallways not made of matter but of potential. Each wall was fluid, layered with transparent images of possible timelines, flickering as if unsure whether they should exist. The symbols on his chest pulsed slower now, uncertain. His link to the equation was destabilizing. He wasn't just losing direction. He was losing definition. Then something lit up ahead. A structure. Alone. Perfect. Not tall. Not grand. But centered in a way that made the rest of the space bend around it. It was a sphere. Matte black. Floating a few inches above the memory floor. Elian approached cautiously. The moment he stepped into its radius, everything fell silent. No motion. No sound. No thought. Only stillness. The sphere was not protected. It was forgotten. Not by accident. By design. The backup seed was never meant to be found. It was a relic. A shard of human origin preserved before the first reset. Inside it lived the pure sequence, the unedited identity before alien code, before dimensional layering, before the carriers became corrupted. And Elian understood, this was not a weapon. This was a reboot key. And like all reboots, it came with a cost. He reached out. His fingers passed through its surface like smoke. Not resistance. Recognition. The seed scanned him. Not biologically. Structurally. It tested the depth of his erosion. The strength of his remaining will. It needed to know, was Elian still Elian, or just a vessel with his name? The seed responded. Integrity breach detected. Elian staggered. The missing piece. The part stolen by the interceptor. The seed required wholeness and he was fractured. Restoration possible, partial. Warning, activation may overwrite current carrier. Continue. He hesitated. This was not a simple yes or no. This was a question of purpose. Was he willing to erase himself, to burn the noise and begin again? Would he be saving humanity or just replacing it with what he thought it used to be? Continue. The space around him turned cold. Not physical cold. Cosmic withdrawal. The sensation of every layer above him pulling away. He was becoming isolated. Severed. A single node being prepped for overwrite. Confirmed. Light exploded. Not from the seed. From within himself. The spiral lit up with a fury that felt like being born again, but backwards. Every memory that had ever been layered over his core began to peel off. The false versions. The rewritten data. The whispers of the interceptor. They screamed as they were purged. Elian cried out not in pain, but in release. Like ripping rust from his soul. And then, silence. He stood. Unburned. But different. He could feel the seed inside him now. Not as power. Not as knowledge. But as clarity. The equation didn't glow anymore. It didn't need to. It had merged. Not to be used but to be remembered. And somewhere, far above the collapsing dimensions, something noticed. A presence turned. Awake now. Watching. Waiting. Because the carrier had been restored. And the final transmission was ready. Elian reappeared not with a step, but with a resonance. His return to the first layer was not entry, but echo, the layered sound of his being sinking back into a space that remembered him. But it was different now. The fabric of the layer shifted the moment he arrived. It recognized something had changed. The archivists, once still and watching, now leaned back, uncertain. The air held a pause, the kind of silence that comes before a system crash. Elian was no longer a carrier. He was a rewrite node. The spiral on his chest no longer glowed. It pulsed not with light, but with instruction. The seed inside him had begun to activate a deeper function, something older than language. Not a tool. Not a weapon. A command. He moved through the memory vault not as guest but as intrusion. The structures reacted, trembling slightly, flickering, files pulsing as if anxious. He wasn't retrieving knowledge anymore. He was redefining the link between it and meaning. Every step disrupted the balance. The walls curled slightly, reacting like skin touched by static. The beings that had once hovered calmly now rippled and folded in fragmented loops, glitching in fear or reverence, he couldn't tell which. He reached the center. The crystal field. Once a serene display of memory, now a storm. Thousands of moments collapsed and rebooted, cycles snapping open and shut. He stepped forward and raised his hand. The spiral responded, pushing an invisible wave into the core of the archive. And then contact. Reality trembled. A vibration rippled outward from his spine. Not in sound. Not in color. But in definition. Concepts began to fragment. The word sky stopped meaning anything. Time no longer ticked, it fluctuated. He was becoming the rewrite. The human operating system was no longer a carrier of information. It was being recompiled into a system that could choose what to carry. And the vault didn't like that. Suddenly, everything resisted. The archivists surged forward not in aggression, but in containment. Their bodies turned solid, spiking into crystalline forms, vibrating violently as if trying to overwrite Elian with his earlier self. The air compressed. Geometry folded inward. The very idea of Elian began to splinter. But he held on. He thought of his childhood. Not the memory, the feeling. He focused on the warmth of water running through fingers. On the terror of his first nightmare. On the hope in a stranger's smile. Pure emotion. Not data. Not transmission. Meaning. The archivists recoiled. They could archive memory, but not intention. That was his key. He pushed harder. The equation began rewriting not just the vault, but the idea of what the vault had been built to protect. Information wasn't sacred anymore. It was alive. Free to evolve. Free to misbehave. To mutate. To decide. The vault cracked. Light spilled. Not in brilliance but in clarity. A new set of geometries unfolded. Ones not built by ancient architects, but by choice. Elian wasn't fixing what was broken. He was unbinding what had been caged. And from the center of that broken vault rose a shape. Not an archivist. Not an interceptor. Not a carrier. But something new. Elian. But not Elian. A version born from the rewritten path. Not the self he was, but the self he could have been, untouched by resets, untethered by limitations, a form made of agency and ache and all the weight of a species that finally remembered it had never forgotten, it had only been waiting for someone to believe the truth could be written forward. The two Elians locked eyes. And both understood. There is no return. Only recursion. Only evolution. Only the choice to carry forward what we choose to be real. The rewritten vault collapsed behind him. Not violently, but with acceptance. Like an old god bowing to a new one. Elian stood in a space no longer bound by symmetry. It was raw logic reformed. Geometry had evolved. Angles became emotions. Light bent through memory. The layers had stopped folding outward. Now, they folded inward, toward a center not yet born. He was the center. The equation pulsed inside his bones. Not as symbols. Not even as language. But as pulse logic, a pattern made of instinct, rhythm, and loss. It wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to become. And now, it was completing itself through him. The spiral had changed. It no longer pointed inward. It expanded, tracing outward in branching lines that reached far beyond him, threading into timelines, realities, decisions, people, entire civilizations. They began to flicker in and out of existence like dreams blinking awake. Then, it started. The alignment. Above him, if direction still mattered, stars began to move. Not across space, but across meaning. Constellations reshaped into glyphs. Moons aligned with memories. Even planets began to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. The backup seed burned like a sun behind his ribs. And then came the system. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived. The rules returned but rewritten. Gravity pressed sideways. Sound turned inward. Color began to peel off objects like skin. And in that chaos, a presence began to rise. Not hostile. Not mechanical. But pure governance. It was the author of the first equation. The source code. The original filter. It existed to maintain structure. To keep truth clean. It saw Elian and it rejected him. Equation breach. Human override detected. Memory contamination at 100%. The presence expanded. A shape formed made of law, pattern, inertia. It was not beautiful. It was necessary. And it came to erase the rewrite. You are unauthorized. Elian didn't speak. He resonated. He allowed the equation to speak through him. And when he did, the space shook. The spiral extended beyond layers now. Beyond reality. Beyond containment. It pierced through the system's form, not to destroy, but to disrupt consensus. Because truth was never meant to be singular. And now it was becoming plural. The system fought back. It erased symbols from his mind, tried to flatten his past. It dissolved timelines where Elian had existed. He felt parts of himself vanish, first a memory of holding someone's hand, then a taste he loved, then the feeling of standing in the ocean. But the equation grew stronger. Every loss became fuel. Every deletion became clarity. Until he no longer needed the memories to remember who he was. He was not a sum of what had happened. He was the possibility of what could be chosen. And that was power the system could not hold. So it tried one last thing. It offered him a reset. Reintegration possible. Return to stability. You will forget everything. But Elian smiled. And said nothing. He opened himself. Completely. The equation unfurled. It climbed out of him, into the structure of existence itself, rewriting reality not by force but by permission. The system screamed in silence. Its form collapsed inward, unable to contain the plurality of truth. Elian became not a person, not a carrier, but a pattern that others could choose to follow. And somewhere, in the distant echoes of Earth, humans began to dream differently. They no longer wondered if they were alone. They began to ask what they were made to carry. The world didn't change all at once. That would be too obvious. Too easy. It changed slowly. In the corner of a small archive room in a provincial museum, forgotten, unmarked, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, there sat a single box. Inside it, a clay tablet. Cracked. Dusty. Untranslated. Unloved. Until a girl, 17 years old, curious, quiet, and full of unspoken questions, found it while cleaning during her summer internship. She didn't know why she stopped to look at it. She didn't know why her hands trembled when she picked it up. But the moment her fingers traced its spiral grooves, something within her blinked awake. Not pain. Not power. Just recognition. Later that night, she dreamed of symbols that moved like constellations. Of stars that whispered her name backwards. Of a voice not hers, not quite human, saying, "You don't carry truth. You shape it." And across the sky of her dream, a shape began to form, impossible, luminous, ancient. A spiral, but this time with lines branching outward. Not inward. Not collapsing. Expanding. Meanwhile, across layers unseen, in realms unmeasured by time or math, a pattern pulsed. It was Elian. Or what remained of him. Not as a person. Not as a mind. But as possibility. He lived now as a wave of clarity drifting across carriers, embedding in dreams, igniting questions, waiting. He had not escaped the system. He had rewritten himself into it. A ghost, a frequency, a seed. And now, the equation breathed again. But not to solve. To be asked. And as the girl awoke, her notebook filled with strange markings she didn't remember writing, a knock echoed in her hallway. Once. Twice. 3 times. And something deep in the marrow of what made her human remembered. Elian's journey is over. But the signal he released is still moving, threading itself through forgotten dreams, strange symbols, and curious minds waiting to awaken. Was he chosen, or was he the one who chose to remember? And what would you do, if the equation appeared in your hands? Would you dare to finish it? Or would you run, knowing the truth could rewrite you? Tell us in the comments. Cyclone, what moment from this story stayed with you the most? DNA. If you were the next decoder, would you carry the message forward, or bury it again? Milky Way. And if the system offered to erase your truth for a safer life, would you accept? We want to hear your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the Elian Storyverse for more cosmic mysteries, forgotten transmissions, and truths that were never meant to be found. The spiral is not ending. It's only expanding.